Well, welcome back. Today I talk about those last few years on the police force when I really got serious about my work and how that led to me making the decision to quit my job, cash in my pension, and paint full time. So in yesterday's episode, I talked about how I read that article from Harley Brown, and he said it was all about hard work. So I decided I was going to commit myself to my art. And as I said, that's when my life changed. Basically, the world got into lockstep with me, and I understood for the first time what the word synchronicity means. But what did I do? How did I go about getting serious about my art? And I guess the first thing that I did is I became a voracious consumer of anything and everything about art. And that for me, that started with subscribing to a number of magazines. So I subscribed to the Artist magazine, American Artist magazine, Watercolor Magic. When it came out, the International Artist magazine, American Art Collector, and I read those every single month from cover to cover and reread them, and started kind of going about the task of learning what's involved in getting kind of serious about art. I also purchased a lot of books on how to paint portraits, how to paint watercolor, and just kind of tried all kinds of stuff, and really worked to improve my skill set. And one of the important things at this time too was I stumbled upon an article that said that that painting and getting good at painting was just like saving money. If you waited till the end of the year to save your spare cash, you'd never save anything. And if you waited until you had spare time to paint, you would never paint. But you had to dedicate that time first. Just like with saving money, you had to take your savings off the top. So I started setting aside time and committing to painting at least 3 times a week for several hours. And I also realized that if I had to get all of my art stuff out to paint and then put it all away when I was done, that would also really interfere. So I created a space where I could leave my work out, and if I only had 2 hours to paint, I could sit down and get 2 hours of painting done. Just eliminating that setup time and that takedown time was really huge. So I started doing that, and as I said, I kind of had to think about what am I going to paint, and so I decided I was going to start painting portraits of my boys, and that's what I did. I also decided that I needed to start surrounding myself with other artists, so I joined the local art association, the Oshawa Art Association. I joined that, and I started going to the meetings and listening to other artists there who were professionals or part-time professionals, and just really made art kind of the main focus of my life. I quit golfing pretty much, and all that time that I used to spend swatting the ball around on the golf course, I spent in my studio painting. And I started to get better. I started to get better fairly quickly just because of doing it. And I reached the point, I guess it was in around 1997, I entered my very first juried art show. So that was a show at the Oshawa Art Association at the McLaughlin Gallery in Oshawa. And it was actually a painting that I had done in water-soluble oils. I'd mentioned before that I was doing a lot of work in watercolor because of Cameron's asthma. Well, I saw this article in, I think it was the Artist magazine, about water-soluble oils, this new product that was coming out where you could clean your brushes with soap and water. So I you could send away for a free trial pack. And we got a little tiny blister pack of a little bit of titanium white, ultramarine blue, cadmium red, and cadmium yellow. And so I thought, well, I'm going to try this stuff out. So I tried these paints and painted a portrait of my son Scott that actually turned out really well. And so I entered that piece in the juried show at the Oshawa Art Association at the McLaughlin Gallery. And that piece not only got in the show, but it won the award for Best in Oils. So I was kind of hooked on the water-soluble oils, and also was really determined now to focus on painting portraits, because that positive feedback is huge when you're just starting out. Again, I didn't really know where I stood in terms of compared to other artists. So getting into a juried show was huge, and then winning an award was huge. I also started doing a lot of research into what was required to kind of build a successful art career, and everything that I read. So again, it encouraged joining other art groups, kind of associating with other artists, and starting to enter juried shows. So I started entering a lot of juried shows, and I actually got in and I won some awards. And the same article said that, you know, when you're winning awards at local shows, then it's time to enter regional or national or international shows. So I entered a watercolor, it was a portrait of my brother, into the annual show of the Canadian Society of Painters in Watercolor, and that got into the show. So I thought, okay, great, I'm a portrait painter, I'm painting in oils and watercolor, now I've been in a national show. So then the next thing was to submit to international shows. So I submitted to the Northwest Watercolor Society show in the US. It's actually now the Transparent Watercolor Society, and I got a piece into that show. So it's like, okay, now I'm an award-winning artist. I've been exhibited in national shows and in international shows. And at that point, I actually started taking on portrait commissions. And so people that I worked with were aware of what was going on, and that I was kind of getting into these shows. Oh, this is when I hosted my very first open house. So that's when I just announced to everyone that I was having a show, and I gave a lot of lead time because I didn't have any work at the time. And over the course of the next 7 months or so, I painted a number of portraits. So I was taking photographs of all my friends when we were out at different events or pool parties or whatever. So I had my camera with me all the time. And then I just painted a lot of portraits of people that I knew, totally on spec. And often they didn't even know I was doing this. And then I was also dabbling in landscapes, which I've always really loved landscapes, but I just wasn't very good at them. But I was also trying out all kinds of different techniques that I was reading about in these various magazines. And so when the day came of my very first show, I had probably about, I don't know, 10 or 12 portraits that I had done of people that I knew. And I also made sure that before the show, I kind of let all of these people know that I had a portrait of them there that they might be interested in. So I ended up selling a bunch of the portraits. I also sold a bunch of the landscape and still life work. But I have to say, my work was really, really cheap. I was doing a half sheet watercolor head and shoulders portrait, and I was selling them for $260 framed. So that's about 25 hours work and about $100 worth of framing. So getting back to what I mentioned the other day about your hourly rate when you start off is not something you even need to concern yourself with. Your time is worth nothing. But what's really important when you start out is getting your work seen and getting your work out there and building up a clientele. So that's how I started. I was still a uniform sergeant at that time at 31 Division in Toronto. And on the day of my open house, I had a lot of people from the police force come out, a lot of family, a lot of friends. And I think I did like $5,000 in sales. And so I was just ecstatic. And then I guess I just kind of got back in the studio and just kept painting. And it was around that time that I got transferred to the fraud squad for the Toronto Police, the headquarters commercial crime unit, which was a really plum position. And so I was investigating frauds that were over $2 million. They had to be over $2 million to come across my desk. And this was also in the back of my mind. I thought, maybe one day I'd be able to leave the police force before retirement. And I thought, if that ever happened, that having that background as a fraud investigator, that would do really well in the private sector if I ever left and needed something to fall back on. But around this time also, Diane had said to me, she said, "Oh, I'm so proud of you that you're pursuing this and you're having such success with your art, but please don't ever come to me and tell me you want to quit your job to paint full time. Because we have 2 young boys and they're going to need to go to university, and it's kind of like, you've got a really good job with a pension down the road, and so yeah, just promise me you'll never put me in that position where you want to quit your job to paint." And I said no. And I had, again, there was always this vague thing in the back of my mind that maybe one day, but it certainly was not something that I was planning on or counting on. And so I continued to just paint. Then I started doing a lot of portraits for the people that I was working with in the fraud squad. It became a kind of, I had always had a list of pending portraits to do. But when I did my portraits, again, very inexpensive, because I was not doing this to make money at this point. I was doing this to kind of get better at the work and to develop an audience for my work. So again, $260 for a half sheet watercolor. And I'll show you some samples of my work that I was doing at the time before this vlog ends today. And I did everything on spec. So I would come out, I would shoot the photographs, I would paint the painting. If the people liked the painting, then they would buy it. If they didn't like it, there was no commitment on them to buy it. And it was this time too, I got my very first digital camera, and it was a 1 megapixel for $1,000. And so I was shooting the photographs. Now I'd moved to digital. Before that, I was shooting with a Canon Rebel, and I was spending about $1,000 a year on film processing. So to go to a digital camera made huge sense. And I also learned a really valuable lesson here too. One of the portraits that I did for one of the guys that worked with me, we shot the photos, and then we just looked at the images on the back of the camera and decided which one to go by. And I came home, did the painting, and the painting turned out amazing. I actually still have it because when I showed it to him, he was like, "Oh, that's a beautiful painting, but it doesn't really look like the way we think of our daughter." And it was very awkward because I was a detective and he was a constable too, so I outranked him. But I could tell as soon as I showed them the piece that it was like there was something not right in terms of their mind. So I actually told them, "Don't worry about it. I can see you're not happy." I said, "If you want, bring your daughter out to my place and we'll shoot some more photos and I'll do another one for you." But this time I made sure we looked at the photos on the laptop, the big photos, so that they could see it. And yeah, so I did another painting of their daughter, and this one they absolutely loved. And this was also a great marketing ploy, even though it just happened, because when the word went around that when they weren't happy with the first one, that I painted another one, all of a sudden there was a lineup of people who wanted me to paint portraits. And so I was basically, full-time police officer working. At this time I was working Mondays to Fridays, straight days, but I was painting, 2 or 3 days a week in the evenings, and pretty much my whole weekends I was painting. And again, it was at this time, I guess, that I got into the annual show of the Canadian Watercolor Society. And when I went down to the show and then to pick up my painting, I was approached by the president of the society, Ed Shawcross, who really, really encouraged me to apply for membership. And so membership in the Canadian Society of Painters and Watercolor is that's a very elite thing to have. And it's a very strict juried process where the members actually get to vote on your work, and they have to approve you to be given membership in the society. So I created a series of portraits, all in transparent watercolor, and went through the initial application process, which was by slides, and then I made it to the final thing, which was bringing the works down it was at the Arts and Letters Club, actually, in Toronto, where the Group of 7 was formed. Bring the work down there. they would have the annual meeting and they would jury the works and they would find out in the afternoon. So that afternoon, I came down to pick up the works, and I got in. So there, now I was a member of the Canadian Society of Painters in Watercolor. I remember the next day they had a luncheon for the society, and I had already kind of paid my money that I wanted to come to this, and they had a couple speakers. But I remember I was standing at the bar of the Arts and Letters Club, and I feel a little poke in the ribs, and I turn around and there's Doris McCarthy. And so for those of you who don't know, at that time she was probably the most famous living artist in Canada. And she kind of poked me in the ribs, and I turn around and she says, "Oh, I don't recognize you. Are you one of our new members?" And I said, "Yes, I was." And I thought, oh my God, I'm standing here at the Arts and Letters Club having a beer with Doris McCarthy. Like, somebody pinch me. And so that was a huge deal for me, getting into that society. At the same time, I applied to the Canadian Institute of Portrait Artists, who also had a juried selection process. And I was elected as a senior signature member of that, which was the very highest level. So those two things, again, really helped to kind of give my work some validity and encourage people to, again, line up for me to paint their portraits. And then I also, there was a huge, this was in 1999, there was a huge show going on, the Federation of Canadian Artists was putting on in Vancouver, and it was like $25,000 first prize and then $25,000 another prize. It was the biggest prize money ever offered for a show in Canada. And so I applied to that show with a painting, and I actually got into that show. Now I didn't win any awards, but because this show was so big and the prize money was so big, a lot of the people who were my heroes at that time in art also were in that show. And so they got the awards, and rightfully so, because again, my work was good, but it still wasn't at the very top. And then later that fall, we had, I guess, what was probably my third open house. And it was a busy day. The house was packed, so we sold a bunch of pieces. I had about 8 or 10 portrait commissions lined up to do. And after the show, Diane said to me, "Okay, sit down, we need to talk," which is not something as a guy you ever want to hear, because I've seen that movie and it usually doesn't end well. But in this case it did. And Diane said to me, "I think we need to talk, not about if you leave the police force to paint full-time, but when you leave the police force to paint full-time. And I think we need to start thinking about that." And you could have knocked me over with a feather, because it was only a couple years earlier we'd had that conversation about that this was never going to happen. But Diane also said something to me that was really, really important, and I actually credit a lot of my success to this, because she said to me, "This is not about you being fulfilled. That's not why I'm suggesting this." She said, "I think there's a chance that this might be in our family's best long-term economic interests for you to pursue your art career full-time." So she said, "I am willing to kind of support you and support doing this as long as it's kind of under those terms. And if it ever becomes clear that this is not in our best economic interest, then you'll put a suit on and go get a job in corporate security." And I said, yes, I totally agreed. But that's was always at the back of my mind, that I had to make this work in terms of being a financial success. And that was my motivation to get up every day, to go in the studio and to do all of the things that I've done since then. So anyways, we talked about it, and this was in the fall of 1999. I thought, it's a new millennium starting. Wouldn't it be great if I start the new millennium as a full-time artist? And so we agreed that I would be quitting my job and cashing in my pension, and crossing my fingers, holding my breath, and taking that leap. So I think it was the next week I was going on a symposium to Bowen Island with the Canadian Society of Painters in Watercolor. So Diane had, when I had applied for membership to the CSPWC, I'd said to Diane, if I get elected, then I want to go on this 10-day painting symposium out off Vancouver. And I still remember she kind of rolled her eyes and went, yeah, okay, if you get elected, you can go. Never imagining that I would get elected, because I'd heard from so many people that it took 5 years of applying to get in. So I was applying more just out of putting into practice doing the things I should be doing, but not really with any expectation that I would get elected. So I went back to work after the open house, and I remember it was on a Friday. I was leaving the next day to go on this painting symposium, and I went in to speak to my boss, the staff inspector of the fraud squad, and to let him know that I was going to be leaving at the end of the year. And it was funny because his initial reaction was, "Oh, where are you going? Hold up, homicide?" And I said, "No, I'm quitting. And he went, "Oh yeah, the art thing." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "So you're going to give it a try?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And so, yeah, I left the next day to go on this painting symposium at Bowen Island. And that was another huge life-changing moment for me. I remember going there hoping to meet some artist that I could become friends with that would act as a mentor for me, who was where I wanted to be as far as a career. And I went on this trip, and I just met so many fabulous people. And I came home with having now 6 or 7 new friends who were way, way further on the career path than I was, and just were of huge, huge help to me in that early part of my career. So yeah, I continued to do the portraits, and when I came home for Christmas holidays in December of 1999, that was my last day at work. My actual retirement date, I think, was January 4th, or not retirement, resignation was January 4th, 2000. So I started the year as a full-time artist. And I remember many nights waking up in a cold sweat thinking, oh my God, what have I done? Because it was not instant fame and fortune and success. It was 5 years of struggling and 5 years of thinking, oh my God, am I going to have to put a suit on and get another job? And I still love this. Diane tells the story. People used to say to her in those first years, oh, you must sleep so much better now that Tim's not on the police force. And her response was, my husband quit his job and cashed in his pension to paint. What makes you think I sleep at all? But anyways, everything did work out, but here we are at 20 minutes again, so this is a good time to stop. Tomorrow, I'll get into, when I started painting full-time, kind of how that kind of went from struggling along to where I am now today. So I hope you've enjoyed this. As always, if you like this, give me a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, share it with your friends, and I welcome your comments. I am Tim Packer, and thank you for your time.